It was a bitter cold night when Mark sat on the sidewalk, his back against a worn-out brick wall. The city was alive with lights and sounds, but he felt a world apart. He hadn't eaten all day and his stomach growled, empty and aching. His coat barely kept the cold out, and the wind cut through him like a knife. But there was one thing that kept him going: his dog, Buddy. Buddy, a scruffy little mutt, had been with Mark for almost 5 years. Together, they'd faced hardships that most people could never imagine. They'd spent nights under bridges, curled up together to stay warm. They shared every scrap of food, every moment of silence, and every fleeting second of joy. For Mark, Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was family, the only family that mattered anymore. Mark had never asked for much in life. All he wanted was a warm meal and a roof over his head. But those were things that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. The world had turned its back on him. People walked by, pretending they didn't see him, pretending they didn't see the man who had once had a life, a job, a home. But Buddy had never turned away. Every day Buddy was there, his loyal eyes watching over Mark, waiting for him to smile, to find a reason to laugh. Buddy didn't care about the rags Mark wore, or how many nights they spent without a meal. Buddy loved him without hesitation, without question. That night, Mark held out the last piece of bread he had, staring at it in his hand. It wasn't much, just a half of a loaf, old and dry. It was all he could afford. As he reached down to share it with Buddy, something inside him stopped him. Buddy was looking up at him, his tail wagging, his eyes full of that familiar love and trust. Mark sighed. Buddy needed it more than he did. Buddy always needed more. More food, more warmth, more care. Mark had seen the way Buddy's ribs showed through his fur, how the cold made him shiver even when he was tucked under Mark's arm. Mark had seen the sadness in Buddy's eyes when they didn't have enough, when they had to skip meals just to get through another day. And tonight, Mark wasn't sure if he could give Buddy any more of his own food. Mark held the bread in his hand for a long moment, and Buddy gently nudged his leg, as if he understood the internal struggle his owner was going through. Mark could feel the weight of his dog's gaze, and in that moment, something shifted inside him. He reached down, breaking off the last piece of bread. "Here you go, Buddy," he whispered, and placed it in front of his dog. Buddy sniffed it for a second, then eagerly devoured the piece, his tail wagging faster than ever. Mark watched him, feeling a rush of love and gratitude flood through his heart. Even in the hardest times, Buddy had always been there, offering him comfort and companionship when no one else would. For Mark, this moment wasn't just about feeding Buddy. It was a reminder that in this cruel world, there were still moments of pure love, moments where sacrifice meant more than survival. As Buddy ate, Mark realized something. He would give everything he had to make sure his dog was happy, because Buddy had done the same for him, every single day. Just as Mark and Buddy were finishing their meal, a man stopped in front of them. Mark didn't look up at first. People walked by all the time without acknowledging him, but the man didn't keep walking. He stood there for a moment before kneeling down, reaching into his coat and pulling out a warm sandwich wrapped in paper. "Looks like you could use this more than I can," the man said, offering the sandwich to Mark with a soft smile. Mark was stunned. He looked up at the man, unsure if he'd heard him correctly. I can't take this," he said, shaking his head. "You don't know me." The man smiled again, his eyes kind and understanding. "I know, but I also know what it's like to go hungry, and I can see that you've been doing your best for your dog." Mark hesitated for a moment before reaching out, taking the sandwich in his hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The man nodded and stood up, walking away without saying another word. As Mark unwrapped the sandwich, Buddy jumped up, his tail wagging furiously, as if he too knew that this was a gift that came from one stranger who understood the bond between a man and his dog. Mark took a bite of the sandwich. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had hoped for. He looked down at Buddy, who was lying at his feet, his head resting gently on Mark's knee. In that moment, Mark felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. This was the kind of love that mattered. Not the love that came with expectations or rewards, but the kind that asked for nothing in return. The love that could make even the hardest times feel just a little bit easier. For Mark, it wasn't about the meal. It wasn't about the kindness of a stranger. It was about knowing that no matter how cold the world could be, Buddy would always be there. And he would always give everything he had for him. And in return, Buddy would always love him back, with no conditions, no hesitation. Sometimes love isn't about the grand gestures or the big sacrifices. Sometimes it's about sharing the last piece of bread. Mark looked up at the sky, his heart full, and whispered softly, "I'll always take care of you, Buddy." Always. And with Buddy by his side, he knew he wasn't alone.